Most Americans have absolutely no idea this just happened. A unanimous Supreme Court decision, all 9 justices agreeing, has quietly reshaped how retirement works across the entire United States. Not one state, not one retirement program, every state. And the ruling doesn't just affect people already retired. It reaches into the financial future of anyone planning to retire in the next 5, 10, or even 20 years. If you have a pension, contribute to a 401k, receive Social Security, or have chosen where you plan to retire based on tax rules, this decision could directly impact you. What makes it so unusual is not just the outcome, but the fact that every justice, from the most conservative to the most liberal, agreed on the same constitutional principle. That almost never happens, and when it does, it usually means the court believes something fundamental about the law needed to be clarified. In this case, the question was simple but extremely powerful. Can states change the rules of retirement after people have already built their financial lives around those rules? For decades, states have argued that they can. Legislators have modified pension formulas, adjusted retirement ages, imposed new taxes on retirement income, and changed financial assumptions that millions of people relied on when planning their futures. But this new Supreme Court ruling draws a very clear line. It establishes a nationwide constitutional standard that could prevent governments from rewriting the rules after people have already made life-altering financial decisions. In other words, the assumptions you used when planning your retirement may now carry legal protection that did not exist before. And that's exactly why legal experts are calling this one of the most important retirement decisions in decades. But to really understand why this ruling matters and how it could affect you personally, we have to start with the case that triggered it, because it began with just one retiree challenging a state law. Hi, I'm Sophia. And on this channel, we take complex legal and financial developments and break them down into clear, practical information that actually matters for your retirement, your money, and your long-term security. Because the truth is, many of the biggest decisions that affect retirees happen quietly inside courtrooms and legislative chambers long before they ever show up in headlines. And by the time most people hear about them, the financial consequences are already in motion. That's why this Supreme Court decision is so important to understand right now. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what the court decided, why every justice agreed, and how this ruling could influence retirement taxes, pension protections, and long-term financial planning in all 50 states. We'll also talk about which groups of people stand to benefit the most from this decision, and what steps you should consider taking to protect your own retirement strategy going forward. Because this case didn't start as a massive nationwide policy fight. It began as a dispute between a single retiree and a state government over whether the rules of retirement could be changed after someone had already spent years making financial decisions based on those rules. That single dispute eventually climbed through the court system until it reached the highest court in the country, and what the justices decided has now created a new constitutional standard that every state must follow. The case that triggered this ruling didn't start as a national controversy. In fact, at the beginning, it looked like a fairly routine dispute between a retiree and a state government. The retiree argued that the state had changed the rules governing retirement benefits after people had already spent years planning their financial future under a completely different set of expectations. The state, on the other hand, argued something governments have claimed for decades. They said they had the authority to adjust retirement-related laws whenever necessary. Legislators, they argued, must have the flexibility to change tax structures, pension formulas, and financial regulations as economic conditions evolve. From the state's perspective, retirement policies are simply part of the broader tax and budget system, and governments need room to manage those systems when financial pressures arise. But the retirees saw the situation very differently. From their perspective, retirement planning isn't something people decide overnight. It takes decades of saving, contributing, calculating, and making life decisions based on the rules that exist at the time. People choose when to retire, how much to save, what kind of accounts to use, and even where to live based on those rules. And the retiree's argument was straightforward but powerful. If the government invites people to plan their financial future under a specific legal framework, it shouldn't be allowed to change that framework later in a way that harms the very people who relied on it. That argument worked its way through the lower courts until the case eventually reached the Supreme Court. And when the justices reviewed it, they didn't just settle the dispute between one retiree and one state. They used the case to establish a national legal standard that now applies across the entire country. In a unanimous Enian decision, the court sided with the retiree and ruled that governments cannot simply rewrite the rules of retirement in ways that retroactively harm people who made financial decisions under existing law. That may sound like a narrow technical issue, but the implications are enormous because retirement planning is built entirely on long-term expectations. People don't just save money. They build strategies around tax treatment, pension formulas, retirement ages, and benefit calculations that are supposed to remain stable over time. When those rules shift unexpectedly, it can completely disrupt a financial plan that took decades to build. And that is exactly the type of disruption the court decided needed stronger constitutional protection. At the center of the ruling is a concept the justices referred to as reliance interests. It's a legal phrase, but the idea behind it is actually very simple. When people make important life decisions based on the law as it exists, the government cannot later change those laws in a way that unfairly punishes the people who relied on them. In everyday terms, it means the rules can't be changed after the game has already started, at least not in a way that harms the players who made decisions based on those original rules. The court explained that retirement planning represents one of the clearest examples of this principle. Think about what goes into preparing for retirement. Over the course of a career, someone might spend 20 or 30 years contributing to a pension system, setting aside money in a 401k, or choosing investment strategies based on how those funds will be taxed later. They might move to a different state because of favorable retirement tax policies. They might choose a specific retirement age because that's when full benefits become available. Each of those decisions is based on the assumption that the rules governing retirement will remain reasonably consistent. Before this ruling, states had enormous flexibility to modify those rules. They could change how pension benefits were calculated, impose new taxes on retirement income, or adjust benefit structures in ways that affected people who had already spent years relying on the previous system. Sometimes those changes were small. Other times they were significant enough to reshape someone's entire retirement plan. What the Supreme Court has now said is that this type of retroactive change cannot happen without meeting a much higher constitutional standard. If a state attempts to alter retirement laws in a way that harms individuals who relied on the previous system, that state must now justify the change under a strict legal test. And importantly, the burden of proof no longer falls on retirees to defend themselves. The burden now falls on the state to prove that its actions are justified despite the reliance people placed on the original law. That shift may sound technical, but in the legal world, it represents a massive change in power. For the first time, the planning decisions millions of Americans have made about retirement are being recognized as interests that deserve meaningful constitutional protection. To really understand why this ruling matters, it helps to imagine how retirement planning works in the real world. Picture someone who spent their entire career building a financial plan around the laws that existed at the time. Maybe they worked for 30 years contributing to a pension system that promised a specific benefit formula. Or perhaps they spent decades saving in a retirement account because their state offered favorable tax treatment for withdrawals in retirement. In many cases, people even choose where to live based on those policies. A retiree might sell their home, move across the country, and settle in a state that does not tax pension income or offers special exemptions for retirement savings. That decision affects everything: their housing costs, their healthcare access, their social network, and their monthly financial plan. Under the old legal framework, states could sometimes change those rules after the fact. A legislature might decide to introduce a new tax on pension income, modify how benefits are calculated, or impose new restrictions on retirement withdrawals. Governments typically defended those changes by arguing that tax policy and retirement regulation fall within their sovereign authority. In other words, They claim the power to adjust the rules whenever necessary for budget reasons. But under the constitutional principle the Supreme Court just reinforced, those arguments now face a much higher barrier. If a retiree made a major financial decision based on a law that existed at the time, such as moving to a state because pension income was not taxed, the government cannot simply reverse that policy and expect that person to absorb the financial consequences. The court recognized that retirement planning involves long-term reliance. People organize decades of financial decisions around the stability of those laws. Changing them retroactively doesn't just alter a policy, it can disrupt someone's entire financial future. So, the justices concluded that governments must respect the reliance individuals place on the legal framework that existed when they made those decisions. This effectively creates a protective shield around retirement planning choices made in good faith under existing law. If a state attempts to change retirement-related policies in a way that harms people who relied on those policies, that change may now face serious constitutional challenges. What makes this ruling even more important is that it doesn't only apply to people who have already retired. It also protects individuals who are still in the process of planning their retirement today. Think about someone in their 40s or 50s who is contributing to a 401k or an individual retirement account year after year. Those contributions are not random. They are based on expectations about how that money will be taxed later when withdrawals will be allowed and what the financial rules will look like during retirement. People build strategies around those expectations. They calculate how much they need to save, how long they plan to work, and how their retirement income will be structured. Before this ruling, states could potentially change certain aspects of those policies after people had already spent decades saving under the original framework. That uncertainty created a level of risk in retirement planning that many people didn't even realize existed. The Supreme Court's decision changes that dynamic in a very important way. The protection of reliance interests now extends forward as well as backward. That means the financial choices people are making today, contributing to retirement accounts, participating in pension systems, and planning future withdrawals, may now carry constitutional protection if those choices were made based on existing law. For example, if someone spends 20 years contributing to a retirement plan because their state promises favorable tax treatment for withdrawals, the state cannot easily reverse that policy once those contributions have already been made. The court's reasoning recognizes that retirement planning is a long-term process built on trust in the stability of legal rules. When governments create those rules, individuals organize their financial lives around them. The ruling essentially says that when people rely on those rules for decades, the government cannot simply change the deal after the fact. That principle is what gives this decision such wide-reaching consequences for retirement policy across all 50 states. To make this protection real and enforceable, the Supreme Court didn't just describe the principle of reliance interests. The justices also laid out a specific constitutional test that states must now satisfy before changing retirement-related laws. This is the mechanism that will determine whether future policy changes are allowed or struck down. According to the ruling, when a state proposes a change that affects retirement income, pension benefits, or the tax treatment of retirement savings, the state must now pass a three-part analysis. The first question is whether individuals made financial decisions based on the previous law. This is where reliance becomes crucial. If people spent years saving, contributing, relocating, or structuring their retirement plans under the assumption that certain rules would remain in place, that reliance must be taken seriously. The second question is whether the proposed change would materially harm those individuals. In other words, would the policy shift significantly, reduce benefits, increase taxes, or otherwise damage the financial plans people built under the previous system? And the third question is whether the state has a compelling justification strong enough to outweigh that harm. This is where the standard becomes much stricter for governments. It is not enough for a state to simply argue that it wants to adjust its budget or modernize its tax system. The justification must be strong enough to overcome the constitutional protection created by individuals relying on the previous law. What makes this framework especially significant is who carries the burden of proof. Before this ruling, retirees who wanted to challenge a state policy change had to fight uphill battles in court. They had to hire attorneys, gather evidence, and prove that the state acted improperly. Governments with their legal teams and financial resources often held the advantage in those disputes. But the Supreme Court's decision shifts that balance. Under the new standard, the presumption begins in favor of the individual. The state must demonstrate that its policy change satisfies the constitutional test despite the reliance people placed on the original rules. That shift in legal responsibility dramatically strengthens the position of retirees and workers planning for retirement. Instead of individuals trying to prove the government wrong, the government must now justify its actions before altering policies that people relied upon for decades. If you're finding this information helpful, let me quickly mention something important. In my next video, I'm going to walk through 3 specific retirement planning moves that financial advisors are already discussing in response to this Supreme Court decision. These are not the usual generic tips about saving more or diversifying investments. They are practical strategy adjustments tied directly to the legal protections this ruling may provide. Depending on your situation, these adjustments could potentially influence how you structure contributions, withdrawals, or long-term tax planning during retirement. So, if you want to make sure you don't miss that breakdown, this would be a great time to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you'll see the next update as soon as it's released, because decisions like this rarely stay isolated to the courtroom. Once a ruling establishes a new legal framework, financial professionals, lawmakers, and retirement planners start adjusting their strategies almost immediately. And that brings us to the next important question. Who benefits the most from this ruling? While the decision technically applies to everyone planning for retirement, there are several groups of people who could see particularly meaningful protection from this new constitutional standard. Understanding whether you fall into one of these groups can help you see why the court's decision could have such far-reaching financial consequences in the years ahead. One of the groups most directly affected by this ruling is state and local government employees who participate in public pension systems. Across the country, millions of teachers, firefighters, police officers, municipal workers, and other public employees rely on pension programs that promise specific retirement benefits after a certain number of years of service. These systems were designed decades ago with clear formulas that determine how much someone will receive when they retire. The formula might be based on years of service, salary history, or a combination of factors that calculate the final pension payment. For most workers in these systems, those formulas become the foundation of their entire retirement plan. Someone may spend 20 or 30 years in public service, believing that the pension rules they started under will remain largely consistent when they eventually retire. But in recent years, many state pension systems have faced significant financial pressure. Some governments responded by making adjustments to the system, raising retirement ages, reducing cost of living adjustments, or modifying the formulas used to calculate benefits. In some cases, these changes affected workers who had already spent many years contributing to the system under the original terms. The Supreme Court's ruling places new constitutional scrutiny on that kind of change. If a state attempts to reduce expected pension benefits for individuals who relied on the original formula when they joined the system, that policy may now face serious legal challenges. The reasoning is straightforward. When someone commits decades of their career to public service based on a defined pension structure, they have built their financial future around that structure. Altering it retroactively could violate the reliance interest the court has now recognized as deserving protection. This doesn't mean every pension adjustment will automatically be blocked, but it does mean states must now justify those changes under the stricter constitutional test the court established. For millions of public employees across the country, that new legal framework could significantly strengthen the security of the benefits they have spent their careers working toward. Another group that could benefit substantially from this ruling includes retirees who chose where to live based on state tax policies. This is far more common than many people realize. When Americans approach retirement, one of the biggest financial considerations is how their income will be taxed. Different states treat retirement income very differently. Some states do not impose any income tax at all. Others provide special exemptions for pensions, Social Security benefits, or withdrawals from retirement accounts. Because of these differences, millions of retirees relocate to states that offer more favorable tax environments. Moving for retirement is rarely a small decision. It involves selling a home, leaving a familiar community, building new healthcare relationships, and establishing a completely new lifestyle. And very often, the decision is heavily influenced by the expectation that retirement income will be taxed a certain way in that state. Under the legal environment that existed before this Supreme Court decision, states had broad authority to modify their tax policies. In theory, a state that once offered tax exemptions for certain retirement income could later decide to eliminate those exemptions or introduce new taxes. From the government's perspective, that change would simply be part of its normal authority to manage the tax system. But for retirees who moved specifically because of those policies, the financial consequences could be significant. The court's new reliance standard creates a much stronger argument that such retroactive changes should not harm individuals who structured their retirement plans around the previous rules. If a retiree relocated based on the promise of certain tax advantages, that relocation itself may now be considered a reliance interest that deserves constitutional protection. In practical terms, this ruling could make it much more difficult for states to revoke retirement tax benefits that people relied on when deciding where to spend their retirement years. There is also another group that may be affected by this ruling, and it's one that many people don't immediately think about: Social Security recipients. Social Security itself is a federal program, but the way benefits are taxed can vary depending on where you live. Currently, a number of states still tax Social Security income at the state level, while others exempt those benefits entirely. For retirees, that difference can have a noticeable impact on their monthly budget. Many people structure their retirement plans around the expectation that their Social Security income will be treated a certain way in the state where they live. Some retirees even relocate specifically to states that do not tax Social Security benefits in order to stretch their fixed income further. The Supreme Court's emphasis on reliance interests raises an interesting legal question about how those tax policies might evolve in the future. If a state were to change its treatment of Social Security income in a way that negatively affects retirees who had already structured their financial plans around the previous rules, that change could potentially face challenges under the constitutional standard the court just established. Legal experts are already debating how far this reasoning might extend. The ruling does not automatically eliminate Social Security taxes in states that currently impose them, but it does introduce a stronger argument that retirees who relied on certain policies should not be harmed by sudden reversals. In other words, while the full implications will likely unfold through future court cases, the decision has opened the door to broader legal debates about how retirement income, including Social Security, can be treated when individuals have clearly relied on existing laws in their long-term financial planning. Another important aspect of the ruling that many people overlook is that it protects more than just retirement accounts or benefit formulas. It also protects the planning decisions people make throughout their careers. Retirement planning isn't only about how much money someone saves. It involves a series of major life choices that are shaped by the legal framework surrounding retirement benefits. People decide when to retire, how long they will continue working, whether they should take early retirement options, and what age they expect to begin receiving full benefits. Each of those decisions is influenced by laws and policies that exist at the time. For example, consider someone who plans their entire career around a retirement age that allows them to receive full pension benefits. That age might determine when they stop working, how they schedule major financial decisions, and how they structure their savings. If the government suddenly raises that retirement age and applies the change to workers who have already spent decades planning around the previous rule, the financial consequences could be significant. The Supreme Court's decision suggests that those types of planning decisions may also qualify as reliance interests, That means the act of organizing your career and financial life around a specific retirement policy could itself carry constitutional protection. This is particularly important for professions where retirement structures are built directly into employment agreements, such as law enforcement officers, firefighters, and other public safety workers. Many of those careers include clearly defined retirement timelines that workers rely on when making long-term life plans. If those timelines were suddenly pushed further into the future for individuals already in the system, the ruling indicates that courts may now examine whether such changes violate the reliance interest those workers developed over the course of their careers. So what should you actually do with this information right now? Understanding a Supreme Court ruling is important, but the real value comes from turning that knowledge into practical steps that strengthen your own retirement planning. The first thing experts recommend is documenting the current retirement policies that apply to you. That may sound simple, but it could become extremely valuable if laws ever change in the future. Take time to record how your state currently treats retirement income. Look up whether your state taxes pensions, whether it taxes Social Security benefits, and how it handles withdrawals from retirement accounts like 401ks and IRA. Save copies of those policies from official government websites, print them, screenshot them, or store digital records that clearly show what the law looked like while you were making your financial decisions. The reason this matters is directly tied to the reliance principle the court emphasized. If your state ever attempts to change those rules in a way that harms retirees or future retirees, evidence showing what the policies were when you made your decisions could become very important. Documenting your reliance doesn't require legal training. It simply means maintaining a clear record of the rules you relied on while planning your retirement. Along with tax policies, it's also wise to keep records related to your retirement accounts and benefit programs. Save your pension enrollment documents. Keep statements from your 401k or IRA accounts. Hold on to communications from employers that describe retirement benefits or formulas. All of this information creates a timeline showing that your financial decisions were made under a specific legal framework. If policies change later, that record could help demonstrate the reliance the Supreme Court described in its ruling. Another step worth considering is discussing this decision with a financial professional who understands how legal changes can affect retirement strategies. Not every advisor will immediately be familiar with the details of this ruling because Supreme Court decisions often take time to filter through the financial planning world. But the advisors who stay informed about legal developments will already be evaluating how the new reliance standard could influence retirement planning. A knowledgeable advisor may help you review whether your current contribution strategy still makes sense under the new legal environment, how your state's tax policies might affect your long-term withdrawals, and whether any adjustments could strengthen your financial position going forward. For public employees, it may also be valuable to review pension plan documents carefully and compare them with current state legislation. If there have been changes to benefit formulas, retirement ages, or cost of living adjustments since you entered the system, those changes could potentially raise questions under the reliance standard established by the court. This doesn't mean every change automatically becomes invalid, but it does mean there may now be stronger legal grounds to examine whether certain adjustments were appropriate. The goal is not to create unnecessary alarm or encourage legal battles. The goal is awareness. When people understand how the law protects their financial decisions, they can take steps to preserve those protections and plan more confidently for the future. Before we wrap up, there's another important reality you should understand about how rulings like this play out in the real world. When the Supreme Court establishes a new constitutional standard, the legal landscape doesn't instantly settle into place. Instead, it begins a new phase where states, lawmakers, and courts interpret how far that standard actually reaches. And in many cases, governments will look for ways to adjust their policies so they still maintain flexibility while technically staying within the boundaries set by the court. Some states may respond by introducing what are known as grandfather provisions. These policies attempt to protect people who are already retired while applying new rules only to future retirees. Other states might implement changes gradually over long periods of time, hoping that courts will view those changes as less disruptive to individuals who relied on earlier policies. There may also be cases where legislators pass laws that push right up against the constitutional line established by the ruling, forcing courts to decide whether those policies go too far. In other words, the story doesn't end with the Supreme Court's decision. In many ways, that decision is just the starting point. Over the coming years, additional court cases, legislative responses, and legal interpretations will determine how this new reliance standard is applied in practice. That's why staying informed about developments in retirement law can be just as important as understanding the original ruling itself. If you want to keep up with how states respond to this decision and what it might mean for your retirement planning, staying connected to reliable information sources can make a real difference. And if you found this breakdown helpful, consider subscribing so you don't miss future updates as this legal landscape continues to evolve. These kinds of changes rarely happen all at once, but the people who pay attention early are often the ones best positioned to adapt their plans and protect their financial future. Now, it's also important to address a question that some viewers may be thinking right now. Does this ruling mean that states can never change retirement laws again? The answer is no. Governments still have the authority to adjust policies when necessary. The Supreme Court did not freeze retirement law in place forever. What the ruling did was raise the standard that governments must meet before making changes that affect people who relied on the previous rules. States can still introduce new legislation, adjust tax structures, or reform pension systems, but they now have to demonstrate that those changes do not unfairly harm individuals who built their financial plans around earlier policies. In some cases, governments may argue that significant financial pressures justify certain changes. For example, if a pension system faces the risk of insolvency, a state might claim that adjustments are necessary to preserve the system for everyone involved. Courts will ultimately decide whether those justifications are strong enough to satisfy the constitutional test. So, while the ruling provides powerful new protection for reliance interests, it doesn't eliminate every possible policy change. What it does is shift the balance of power. Instead of individuals having to defend themselves against sudden changes to the rules, governments must now show that their actions respect the expectations people relied on when planning their retirement. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, this ruling represents something larger than just a legal technicality about retirement law. It reflects a broader principle about fairness and long-term financial planning. Retirement is not something people decide on a whim. It's the result of decades of work, saving, and planning. People make decisions about their careers, their families, and their financial futures based on the rules that exist at the time. They commit years of contributions to pension systems. They carefully calculate how much to save in retirement accounts. And they often choose where to live based on how their retirement income will be treated. All of those decisions depend on a basic assumption that the rules governing retirement will remain reasonably stable. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision reinforces the idea that those expectations deserve respect under the Constitution. When individuals build their financial futures around laws created by the government cannot casually change those laws in ways that undermine the plans people spent decades constructing. That principle does not guarantee that retirement policies will never evolve. But it does mean that governments must carefully consider the real human consequences of altering those policies. The court's reliance standard effectively acknowledges that retirement planning is one of the clearest examples of long-term trust between individuals and the legal system. And when that trust exists, the law must protect it. Ultimately, the true value of this decision will depend on how people use the protections it creates. A Supreme Court ruling by itself does not automatically secure someone's retirement future. What makes the difference is how individuals respond to the information it provides. If you take the time to understand the policies that apply to your retirement, document the rules that influenced your financial decisions, and stay informed about how your state responds to this ruling, you place yourself in a far stronger position than someone who never hears about these changes at all. Knowledge becomes a form of financial protection, and that's really the purpose of discussions like this. to make sure you have the information needed to ask better questions, make better decisions, and safeguard the plans you've spent years building. If you found this explanation useful, consider sharing it with someone who is either retired or actively planning for retirement. Many people may never hear about this ruling until long after its effects begin shaping policy decisions across the country. Staying informed today can make a meaningful difference tomorrow. The Supreme Court has drawn a new line around the expectations people rely on when planning their retirement. What happens next will depend on how states respond, how courts apply the new standard, and how prepared individuals are to protect the plans they've worked so hard to